This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this lunchtime webinar. I know it's lunchtime for many of you, so I appreciate you making the time to join in. I'm going to be talking to you about the innovative leader and project management techniques to enable teams to achieve successful outcomes. So my name is Laura Jensen. I'm a program manager at the Green Bank Observatory in Green Bank, West Virginia, which is also affiliated with the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. Previously, I was the director of IT project management at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., and I was also a deputy director of quality assurance at NPR, which is National Public Radio. I have a number of project management related certifications, project management professional, certified in COSE systems engineer, and also have several Scrum related Agile certifications. So I mentioned the Green Bank Observatory, which is located in Green Bank, West Virginia, which is a very rural area where you live. We're actually in a radio quiet zone where there's no wireless or cell phones, which is always interesting. But those devices interfere with the ability to detect radio signals from outer space. So the Green Bank telescope is a 100-meter telescope. It's the world's largest steerable moving object. So it's about the size of a football field, and we can actually move it around. If anyone is interested in ever visiting Green Bank, I highly recommend it. You can get your science on and come see the site. We have an exhibit hall. We have tours for the public. We have activities for kids. So it's a nice rural setting, but also a nice setting to sort of see this amazing telescope and learn more about science. So for today's topic, I'm going to be talking about innovative leadership, and some of the things that I want to discuss are, what is the role of leadership? What does it mean in today's world as basically management and project management techniques are evolving? So we'll talk a bit about what traditional versus agile project management means and what that then means towards leadership. Communication is always critical, but even more critical in terms of sort of rethinking leadership roles. I'll hopefully give you some tactical planning tools that you can use if you want to take some techniques back to your workplaces, and also go over some team building techniques. So what is leadership? I went to actually a very interesting talk last year, I guess, with Larry Yatch, who runs Sealed Mindset. And he gave a talk on leadership from the Navy SEALs perspective. And I thought it was fascinating because it wasn't necessarily what you would expect. He talked about the fact that for the Navy SEALs, the senior management and leaders are really about making sure that the teams that are going out on the missions have the tools that they need, that they can function and drive their own missions without being able to communicate, with their management that's back, wherever. So I really thought that was a very interesting perspective on leadership that ties into some of the leadership thinking that's going into some of the new management methodologies. So one of the definitions that he had that I've kind of modified is that basically leaders create an environment that enables teams to make the right choices. So he talked a bit about situational leadership, where at any given moment, a certain individual with a specific skill set may be called upon to be the leader at that moment. So it was a very interesting way of thinking about leadership that I thought tied into some of the things that we've been looking at from an agile project management perspective. And I'll talk more about that. So then what is the role of management? So management typically is a positional authority. It means that you have a manager title, you're a project manager, you have some authority, you may be a supervisor. So the idea is that managers create the environment that supports leaders and teams in making the right choices. And then, of course, the core is really the teams. So the teams are the ones that are making the work happen. they make choices, and they perform the work to create the desired end state. So they're really the ones that are kind of out there doing the work, making things happen, hopefully with the support and tools from the management team, basically to empower them to do their work. So this graph is from a book by Laurie Mitchell Wingate on project management for research and development, and I thought it provided kind of a nice, simple diagram of R&D. So I'm not sure how many of you are involved in research and development aspects, but it sort of gives you a nice visual of the fact that when you're sort of in an early research and development phase, basic research, you may have an idea that you're exploring, that there's probably a low level of management associated with that because it's really more exploratory. And then as you progress from applied research, where you're really looking at applying the research that you're doing to a specific problem or solution, then you sort of get more formal as you go in terms of the amount of rigor that might go into the management or the project management. And then, of course, once you get into construction or implementation, development, and testing, generally speaking, there's a pretty high degree of formality around that. So for those of you that may be familiar with traditional, what I call traditional project management, this is, for project managers, comes right out of the product management body of knowledge PMBOK guide. So for anybody that's a PMP, this is kind of the backbone of what you study at traditional project management, where there are, very specific and structured processes and knowledge areas that go into managing a project and sort of expected protocols that you would use. So, it takes a project through initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing. And then within each of those process groups, there are a number of activities that are recommended as best practices and a number of documentation that you would come out with, sort of capturing the plans as you progress from each of those stages within a project. So it's a very structured approach. Traditionally, Waterfall is used, where Waterfall has different stages of a life cycle of the systems development. So you have planning, designing, building, testing, and deliver. And the reason it's called Waterfall, of course, is that each of those stages kind of leads to the next. So you finish planning, and then you go into design, and then you finish design, and you go into build. So I've seen projects that have run anywhere from months to decades, really, using this waterfall approach, which was really kind of the classic way of managing projects. So flowing down from how projects are managed is kind of the traditional leadership role. And historically, most of the project managers that I've seen, and some of the managers for that matter, take a command and control, what we call a command and control approach. So, the notion is that managers and leaders need to be authoritative, decisive. They need to direct the work. There's a lot of checks and controls, making sure that the quality is there, focusing on processes, tools, and policies. There's the command and control leader typically has the positional authority that I mentioned. It's more of a hierarchical structure where, it's the manager's on the top managing down. And traditionally building teams to execute policy and implement plans. So traditional approaches typically support well-defined activities and projects. The focus is on efficiency and structure. You've got an organized project, you know what you're going to do, you have milestones, you have, definition around schedule. So the management level decision-making happens at that level, and the leadership is typically top-down. So since the 1980s and the 1990s, Agile has really started to take hold. And Agile is kind of a recognition that the world isn't necessarily as structured as it used to be, and projects by their nature can't necessarily be as structured as they used to be. So this graph gives me a nice representation of, the low to high level of experience on the left, the level of uncertainty or risk that you may be facing on the bottom, and then the level of customer involvement on the right side. So traditionally, waterfall or traditional approaches have been really successful when things are well-defined, there's a low level of uncertainty. The level of experience in implementing the project or the product or whatever it is that's being produced is high. And the customers aren't necessarily looking to be highly involved. So that's kind of, as things have shifted, that's kind of the target space now that I think, some of the traditional and waterfall approaches really work best. The agile world has come to sort of represent, an acknowledgement that technology is moving so quickly, things have to be able to adapt and change. Things have to be produced more quickly. You may enter into projects because there's a market need to get something out quickly, but you might not have all of your requirements defined up front. So some of the agile methods give you the ability to better react to change, build iterative cycles, have a high degree of customer involvement in your processes to inform the effort as it's going along in a much more collaborative way. So that segues into agile project management, which I mentioned is kind of a cultural shift to support change and innovation. It really encourages open communications between team members, stakeholders, and customers. Of course, we would say that communications is always essential, even in traditional, but agile really places a real premium on that. And then it empowers teams to make decisions and to give them the tools to guide them. But really, that empowerment of the teams is kind of a really key point to Agile of letting the teams and the collective wisdom of the representatives on the team figure out how to do things best. So when we compare Agile and traditional from a methodological perspective, you'll see at the top here we have sort of the waterfall approach where you have a sequenced plan of life cycle stages, an analyze, plan, design, build, test, deploy. Whereas one of the attributes of Agile too is that it looks at a much more iterative approach. So you could take design, build, test as an iteration, learn from that, and then go to the next iteration, learn from that, and go to the next one. And conceivably, you could even be, depending on what the product is, deploying new software, new hardware at each of those cycles and then gradually building on it. So one of the nice things about Agile, and particularly with Scrum, which is what I've got represented here, is that it gives you a very clear definition of roles. And these are not hierarchical. In fact, all of these roles are equally important. So in Scrum, for example, you have a product owner, you have the team members, and you have a Scrum Master. So those are just the three key roles that would be involved in building a product. So the product owner is somebody who represents the customer, could be the customer, or it could be a representative of the customer, but it's basically somebody who knows what needs to be built, has the vision, and can communicate that vision to the team. It's not unusual that would be a business person as opposed to a technical person, but it really just should be the person that really understands the value of what you're trying to build and the value from a business proposition of why somebody is interested in this product or why they would pay for it or why they would use it. So the product owner should be empowered to make decisions, and that person should also have the ability to prioritize the work that the team is doing. But that person should not prescribe how the work is going to be done, because that really is the domain of the team. So on Scrum, a team is a self-managing and typically a cross-functional team. They choose how to best accomplish their work. So a product owner will tell them what the most important feature is, for example, from a customer perspective, and then the team gets to dissect how it would build that feature and how long they think it will take. So that's the area that the team itself owns, is how long and how they're going to go about doing it. So they may have specialized areas of expertise that contribute to that development effort, and they also own the accountability for the delivery of their work and the quality. So there's a role called the Scrum Master, which despite its name is actually considered a servant leader. So the Scrum Master helps those on the team understand how Scrum is supposed to work, and also tries to protect the team to make sure that they're not having distractions that prevent them from focusing on what they need to do. It helps remove impediments blocking a team's work. So, for example, if there's a tool that the team needs or a computer that isn't working, that's holding them back, the Scrum Master would try to attend to some of those logistical details. So the Scrum Master's job is really to work with people. This was a statement in the 2016 State of the Scrum Report that really described this as somebody who has good communication and facilitation soft skills, not necessarily a technical person, because the goal here is really that this person is helping to facilitate that the work is happening. But unlike a project manager, they're not really, tracking status or being, a nagger or that kind of thing. So where is the project manager? I was on a webinar a couple of weeks ago that was given by a systems engineer who I think was using lean technologies, and he declared with glee that they're doing lean, so therefore there are no managers. So I had to laugh about that because the point was not incorrect, but I think it's also that we just haven't obliterated managers or project managers by going with agile or lean techniques. So it's true that there is no project manager on a Scrum team. There's the product owner, the team members, and the Scrum Master. And some of the things that a project manager would normally track are being managed by different groups. So like the Scrum team would own task management, schedule, budget is probably owned by the product owner. Risk management is being watched out for the team collectively. But there is still a role for a project manager. So that person can support the product owner or the team. That person, a project manager, can be a stakeholder for review meetings when the team collects to sort of give progress updates and show and tell of what they've accomplished. It's nice also to have Agile because the project manager gets really a gold mine of data and metrics from the Scrum process that really I think is much more detailed in terms of where things are in terms of how much work has been accomplished and what's remaining to be done. And if the project manager has the right mindset, they can also serve as a product owner or a Scrum Master. It does require a bit of a mind shift from a traditional project management role because it becomes more of a supportive role and more of a facilitator or a mentor rather than a person who's sort of accountable for tracking and making sure that things are done according to some of the standard structured processes. So where's the manager? So if a Scrum team is really self-managing and you set up a team that is feeling empowered and they know what to do, then there shouldn't be a manager telling them what to do. So that's kind of a step back from some of the traditional management roles. But there's still a role for managers, of course. I mean, there's higher level staffing, there's more strategic planning, there's resourcing. They can assist with the removal of impediments. There's always going to be, payroll, performance kinds of things for managers to do. So we haven't just completely eliminated the role of a manager. And a manager can be a stakeholder for reviews. So again, that's an opportunity for them to provide guidance and expertise based on what they sees coming out of the work product and how well it meets the stakeholder needs. And I've also had managers participate on teams. And some of them have done this very successfully. When a manager actually has tasks assigned to him or her from the backlog, they can, then they make an effective team member. But in order to do that, there should be the ability to avoid taking a hierarchical position or trying to tell the other team members what to do, but really sort of just participating as a colleague. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a very high level sort of comparison of traditional to agile methods, and this is, in some ways overly simplistic, but so like I said, traditional project management is typically plan-driven, it's structured, you know what you want to build. Time and cost may be a little bit fluid if your scope is fixed. So in other words, we have to build this thing, and it's got all these requirements. So that's the basis on which success will be measured. So you have kind of this, what they call the iron triangle, where the scope at the top may be fixed, time and cost may be triggers that you have a little bit of flexibility around, but you know what you're doing, which is essentially what we're saying by scope. Agile kind of turned that upside down and looks at value-driven approaches. So what you're building may be feature-driven and based on priorities. Your time and your budget may be fixed. So if your time and budget are fixed, then the fluid lever that you have is the scope. So it would be whatever you can accomplish within the targeted time frame. And that's where the product owner and the prioritization all comes into play to make sure that the focus up front is on the highest value items. It could be the highest risk items to make sure that those get done first. And then as you go along, what I think Agile also embraces is the fact that you may get to the last, third of your requirements and find that those no longer carry as much weight or as valuable, so you can really get the value out of the first 2/3 of your product. So just to compare leadership skills, and this kind of traces back to the traditional versus the Agile. Traditionally, you have managers and leaders who, take the command and control approach. They lead from the front. They direct and instruct, checking and controlling, deciding, managing. It might be that they tend to focus more on using technology to do things faster and cheaper. There's an emphasis on process and tools. Whereas in sort of the Agile mindset and the more innovative approaches, leaders lead from the side, which means that they're facilitating and mentoring, trusting and delegating, consulting, empowering, using technology potentially to do new things or different things. And the emphasis has kind of swung more to people and interactions rather than processes and tools. So which is better? Actually, I may sound like I have a bias, and maybe I do, but the truth is that there's no one method or leadership style that is best for all situations or all projects. What approach is taken and what leadership style is appropriate may vary depending on the nature of a project or the nature of an organizational culture, the nature of the stakeholder expectations. So from my perspective, I think it's good to have a broad understanding of the pros and cons of the different approaches and the features that each of them bring, so that you can sort of tailor how you approach things with a lot of tools in your toolkit. So I don't know how many of you on this webinar are managers, are leaders, are team members hoping to develop your leadership skills. But some things to keep in mind as you think about, evolving your leadership style are, looking at ways to encourage the people around you to bring new ideas and changes to processes. And one way to do that is to create opportunities for teams or task forces to solve problems. And depending on the nature of the work, you may not have the opportunity to introduce a new project or introduce a new technology within the work that you're doing. But it's possible to create teams around problem solving, even if it's a business process improvement activity, for example. There could be something like your proposal development process that just isn't working quite right. So it's possible to form teams and task forces around activities like that give people an opportunity to try some team building activities out, to sort of grow their wings and explore some leadership opportunities that they might not ordinarily have. So one of the key things, obviously, is as you develop your leadership skills, is you can never over communicate, and to make sure that there's a cohesive message that brings the team together. So as far as forming a high-performing team, like I said, a really critical first step is to make sure that the team has a common understanding of what they're trying to do, that there's sort of shared goals, an understanding of the strategy, the organizational vision. So one thing that you can do when you form a new team or an existing team is to have someone come in and present to the team that has that strategic vision, that can really talk about why what you're doing is important. And then ask the team for suggestions on how they can contribute to that vision. And then you can create a plan around those ideas. It's also good to obviously discuss concerns and development action plans and bake those into what the team is going to be tackling. Creating a team charter is a nice thing. This can be a document. A little later on, I'll talk about an A3, so it could be an A3. But it gives the team sort of a collective sense of purpose that's written down, that everybody is kind of signed off on. And then challenge the team. I mean, you don't want to. Part of what makes building a team and setting them loose on a product or a project or a process improvement activity is to make sure that it's going to challenge them, but hopefully challenge them in a fun way. So it's good to set some early and realistic initial targets so that they get a sense of progress early on. And then the recommendation is to keep teams fairly small so that there's good communication between all the team members. So plus or minus 7 is kind of a general rule of thumb there. So again, I always get a lot of questions about, well, what do you do about conflict? Because it's inevitable when you get teams together that they're not always going to agree. So obviously, achieving some sort of consensus is important. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody, always agrees 100%, but sort of reaching a point where there's consensus is important. So it's good to have those discussions in the team environment. If you find that people really are not capable of sort of breaking through some of the disagreements, one tool or technique is to have a facilitator individually collect from the team members something like a form that has, sort of their understanding of the goal, their concerns with the goal, and their suggested remedy, and sort of collect that individually from the team members and then bring it all together for a team discussion. Because what we usually find in this is that you'll actually find some degree of commonality that can be brought out into the discussion to hopefully sort of bridge some of those divides. So once you have your high-performing team, or if you're on a team already, some things to keep a team motivated. I've worked with some teams that have been in place for 5 or 6 years, and that's a long time for a team to stay motivated and highly performing. So you want to mix it up a little bit. Whenever possible, it's always good to bring in a customer to interact with the team, whether it's periodically or once a year, or however frequently you can arrange it. And whether it's at your site or their site, or if need be virtually, that's always a great thing, because it's really important for people who are doing the work to realize how it's impacting others and the value that it's providing. So whenever possible, we encourage face-to-face communications, of course. Celebrate, successes, debrief on what went well, look at what challenges happened, but make sure that you focus on both the successes and the challenges. It's good to encourage experimentation. That's where the innovation comes from. Something that some of the teams that I used to work with did was, they'd have serendipity days where they'd carve out some time for teams to explore topics of interest that weren't tied to, deliverables or plans that are already in place, but gave them sort of a freedom to explore different things. I mean, it could be a day every few weeks. It could be a couple weeks a year, whatever the time frame is. But it's nice to have that sort of opportunity to sort of break free of obligations and maybe pursue, development or research or ideas that team members may want to explore. Another nice thing to do is atmospheric audits, and this is a way just to identify if there are issues affecting the team, by talking to individual team members that may be preventing them from feeling like the team is fully performing, and that may make it not so much fun to be on the team. Obviously, most of us that are paid to work aren't necessarily being paid to have fun, but it's important that you're getting some enjoyment out of what you're doing. And a lot of these sort of agile methodologies, I think, really focus more on the fact that the team building exercise also brings a shared purpose, which also brings some joy to what you're doing. And then, like I said earlier, I mean, it's really important to recognize and celebrate team successes. So I mentioned earlier an A3 template. This comes out of a lot of the lean thinking. So this is literally a one-pager. It's usually 11 by 17, and it has these very high-level categories. But it's a nice way to concisely capture what you're trying to do on a one-page brief. So you don't have to write a 10-page document or a 20-page research paper. But as a team collectively, you can use this template to really sort of clarify what it is you're trying to accomplish in a very brief amount of space. So I'm a big believer in visual management. If your workspace permits it, it's great to have sort of what we call these information radiators that show progress on individual teams. So you can put Post-its, low tech, just move them across as work is done, share successes, share where you are. And it's a nice way to just have something visually out there that, people can walk by and say, oh yeah, that's great, that's happening, or that's moving along. It's a really important way to, I think, communicate visually that stuff is happening. And those approaches can be personalized. This was a board that a communications team developed that they kind of used an airplane motif where they have things taking off and things have landed. And so, you can really have fun with this and make it your own. So, like I said, it's a great way to communicate progress. There's nothing like the feeling when all the tasks are done and they've moved over. This gentleman works in our cryogenic lab, and I think he looked at me like I had two heads when I showed up with this thing and stuck it on his door. He was building a two-compressor system that had never been done before for one of our customers. And so this is a nice way of having Post-its that we could move around and we could talk about and we could have fun with. And it was just a much more collaborative way of tracking progress than me showing up as a project manager with a task list and a schedule saying, well, where's this task and, when are you going to be done? I think this was a lighter weight way of approaching, that progress is being made, things are on track, but it was also, a more collaborative approach. And that's not to say that there aren't electronic tools out there. I use Jira a lot, so this is a tool called Jira, Jira. So basically it does the same thing electronically. You can create boards, you can move stories or Post-it equivalents across different columns to show progress. You can assign them to different people. And Jira has a lot of other tools. It has, you can use it as a bug tracker, an issue tracker. It has a sort of a wiki page. So there's a lot of powerful tools in Jira. In GreenBank, we're using a cloud-based version, which if you have 10 users or less is quite affordable. So if you're not using Jira, I think it's worth looking into. So I wanted to give you a couple of specific case studies from projects that I've worked on and am currently working on. So one of the first projects that I worked on when I came to the GreenBank Observatory was a phased array feed. Basically, they were building a first-of-its-kind 900-pound receiver for the GBT, the GreenBank telescope. And when I came, I think they were sort of at the cusp of going from the design phase to the actual construction phase. And there was a bit of miscommunication. I think that senior management, looking at a project plan, thought that the delivery date was much earlier than the practical reality of where the project was at that time. So you'll see that we started with the traditional project plan, has tasks and schedules. And so one of the first things I did was work with the team to update that to a more realistic timeline. But then I kind of threw the kitchen sink into this one. So I created these what's called Kanban boards, these low-tech sticky boards where you basically just move individual task Post-it notes across columns of, not started, in progress, there's an issue, and into done. And I put that up in the team meeting room. So it was a nice way that anytime we had team meetings, you could see right away at a glance where we were and what things were, moving along. And then down at the bottom in the lower left is a cumulative flow diagram that comes from Jira. So I had an electronic version of this board as well. And I found that lower left diagram to be especially useful when talking to senior management, because it really shows at a glance the progress that's being made. Because the orange were the backlog of items to be worked on, the tealish color was the work that was in progress, and then the green is the items that were being completed. So by the time we got to the end of the project, you'll notice that the green goes all the way up to the teal. There's still a little bit of orange left, which represents kind of what I talked about earlier, that as we got to the end, we realized that there were things that we had maybe planned at the beginning that weren't essential. So we just didn't end up, by choice, we did not end up doing those. And frankly, the receiver did not need those things, so they were actually not essential things. When I talk about team building, one of the things that I like to do is take pictures. I know some people are camera shy, but people really like to see themselves generally in photos and see the progress that's being made photographically. So that's part of the team building activities. Just take lots of pictures as you go. Especially, for this project in particular, it was really fascinating because, there were lots of pieces to construct and lots of different stages. So I even went with the receiver when it got installed on the telescope. So some of those pictures you'll see are from that. I was lucky enough, the picture on the right is one of our engineers, was working on the firmware and had been having trouble with, it not working properly, and then magically, she tried to run and it worked. I was lucky enough to get a photograph of that. So it's really a nice way to sort of document and make personal the journey that you're on. And these photographs came in very handy in terms of, all staff meetings where, the president or the site director would give a presentation and be able to show pictures that, made it much more concrete and much more personal as far as updating staff on what was going on. And then we also used them in employee newsletters. So it's just nice to have, photographic evidence of the progress that you're making. So we did deploy this receiver. It went up on the Green Bank telescope and was very successful. We set a world record in terms of system noise temperature. So you'll have to ask a scientist what that means, but ultimately it was very successful. So the project, just as an example, a project I'm working on now is called Lassi. It's a laser active surface scanning instrument. Basically, the Green Bank Observatory got funding from the National Science Foundation to procure a laser scanner, a commercial laser scanner, and hopefully install it on the Green Bank telescope to measure for thermal deformations that occur during the day. Some of our high-frequency observing is more susceptible to these deformations and the heat that comes out of daylight hours. So the hope is that if we are successful at installing this laser scanner and then building the software that will allow us to correct the surface of the Green Bank telescope in a very small time window, like 15 minutes or less, that we'll actually be able to almost double our amount of high-frequency observing during the day. We can do low-frequency observing during the day, but not the high-frequency. So that's kind of the goal here. So this project actually just started in September. We're still in the honeymoon phase, but I think it's off to a good start. So some of the things that we did to sort of get up and running, we have a cross-functional core team of scientists, engineers, software developers, project managers, and we meet biweekly. And basically our biweekly meetings are kind of a catch-up. Usually if somebody has something, progress that they've made, they do some show and tell, which is a great way of making sure that everybody on the team, even if it's a engineer who's looking at a software show and tell, that everybody kind of has a common understanding of where we are and feels like they're in it together. I'm running this using a combination of some of the traditional and agile techniques. I've got a Microsoft project plan, which is traditional, and also trying to track earned value and cost pretty in a pretty detailed way. As I mentioned earlier, we kind of have a set schedule and budget. So therefore, our scope is what we are being a little bit fluid about. So one of the things that we created is what's called a concept of operations document. And that was one of the first things that we did. So basically, the concept of operations describes how we see this instrument and the system being used operationally when we're done. So basically, that's creating the common vision of the end state that I mentioned at the beginning. And one of the things that we've done is we've created what's called a minimum viable product. So because our scope and our schedule and our budget are fixed, we're trying to make sure that we can deliver something that's going to provide value to the observatory and also to meet NSF expectations within our time frame. So we're trying to focus on what minimally we need to provide that value, which is called the MVP. So that's a term that the team has come to adopt. We all know what the MVP is. We're all working towards that. And then obviously if it goes really, really well, then you could potentially add in new features once you've at least met that minimal milestone. But we'll see. This is going to be a 3-year activity, so I can come back maybe in a year or two and let you know how it's going. So I have some recommendations. If you're listening to this and you are a manager or a project manager, I'd encourage you to think about your role and whether it could be more supportive, whether there are ways that you could transition into being a facilitator and a mentor as much as a decision maker or a driver to really sort of harness the energy and the power of the people that are either working for you or that are working on your teams so that they really have a leadership and an ownership stake in the successful outcomes. And you can create opportunities for teams to tackle challenges and become situational leaders. Like I said, even if you don't have a specific product that you can try this out on, maybe it's opportunities to create task forces to do improvement activities or process improvement activities. Just things to mix it up a little bit, give teams opportunities to lead. Communication is key, setting sort of a baseline understanding and making sure that the vision is clear is really a key part of making sure that a team comes together. I recommend having tactical plans to create these common understandings. The concept of operations that I mentioned in the example is a good way to go. Teams also like it when managers get involved and roll up their sleeves, now, as long as you don't mess anything up. But if there are ways to contribute that you can actually participate in, that's always a nice thing to do as well. If you're listening to this webinar and you're somebody who's a team member or somebody who's looking to develop your leadership skills, I'd encourage you to remember that leadership is not a trait. I think there's a common misperception that leaders are born. But really, I've seen a lot of people become good leaders. And like I said, a lot of it is situational. So if you're a subject matter expert, but you're an introvert, there will be times when you could be a leader. So it's really about actions and about getting things done and knowing what it takes to get things done. So take advantage of opportunities for situational leadership. Identify challenges and push for team approaches when you can. There's communication in that case, upward and outward, is really critical. So something like the A3 that I showed you earlier is a really good way to sort of capture what it is you're trying to accomplish and actually have a game plan that you can share that makes it more credible and concrete. So I have a few resources that I put up here, some of the books that I've used as references in this presentation. Some of the lead with respect is coming out of the Lean world. The Scrum, The Art of Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time, is a relatively brief, but in some ways very, it takes you through the Scrum process in a very sort of brief but holistic way. So I highly recommend that, even if some of you, will probably never have an opportunity to do Scrum, or it's just not in your area of work. I think some of the techniques that I've talked about that have come out of Scrum inform how you interact with teams and others in your daily work. Certainly, if you're a manager, I think there are techniques that you can learn that would be applicable. The FYI for teams is a nice book because it actually has some checklists too that you can use in terms of where teams are at and things to do to sort of move to the next level. And then I mentioned earlier some of the project management for research and development by Lori Wingate, which has some detailed sort of graphs and techniques that are used in traditional project management approaches. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. Norval, I think you might have some questions there.
Hi, Laura. Thanks. We do have some questions. The first one I see is from Thomas. The comparing leadership style slide suggested that traditional focuses on process and tools versus innovative leadership, which focuses on people and interaction. Please speak more about this.
So so a lot of the traditional project management techniques, like I mentioned, come out of sort of the project management body of knowledge, which is well documented and well understood by practitioners, and it does have a tendency to sort of look at processes, tools. Here are the things that you need to do at different stages of the project. So there's a focus on sort of the structure around it. In recent years, the pendulum has kind of swung, excuse me, to sort of the agile project management methodologies, which recognize that you have to be adaptive and you have to change. And so there's something called the Agile Manifesto, which looks at for where focus used to be on process and tools. Can we put more emphasis on people and interactions? Where processes used to focus on having comprehensive documentation, can we look at having working systems and maybe lighter weight documentation? Where we maybe used to focus on having contracts and contract negotiations with customers. Can we envision where we would maybe focus more on collaboration? And where things used to be very carefully and structured plans, is there an opportunity to sort of recalibrate and reassess where you are as you go in these more iterative cycles? So there's kind of been a mind shift, I think, in terms of sort of the agile recognition, and that kind of flows down into the leadership styles as well, where leaders in the agile world need to be. The focus is really more on teams. So if you're focusing on teams, how can you make the teams be the best they can be? And that's really more about facilitation and mentorship than directing or managing. So that's, I think, where sort of the pendulum has kind of been moving a bit. And like I said earlier, it doesn't necessarily mean one's better than the other. There may be different circumstances that traditional versus agile applies, but it kind of just opens up new ways of thinking about things, and maybe there are techniques that a person can take from agile that would apply in a more structured situation. For example, really thinking about how you make work happen from a team-oriented approach. So Norval, it looked like there was another question.
Yes, there is. Greg is asking if you could show the slide referencing the books, please.
Okay, let me just go back to that, and I'll leave that up for people.
Okay. Okay, and Greg says thanks. Okay, we're going to move on to the next question. We are going to be running up short on time here.
Okay.
Next question is from Ning. How does the traditional sponsor fit into the agile model?
So it depends on what you mean by a traditional sponsor. If the traditional sponsor is, say, the customer, then that's really kind of at the core of what agile was, sort of designed around is this close collaboration with the customer. And, it may require a little bit of a mind shift change, but the idea is that you want to have that connection, direct connection if possible, between the customer and the team that's building a product, so that there's this constant back and forth about what are the priorities, what are we building the right thing, so there aren't any surprises at the end. So I think what the Agile world is trying to do is bring that high degree of interaction much more closer to where the work is happening, whereas in a more traditional approach, sometimes the customer may pay your organization and periodically get status reports or periodically look at work in progress, but maybe be a step or two removed from the people who are actually doing the work. So it's a bit of a mind shift change, both for the sponsor and the people doing the work. But ultimately, I think generally speaking, it goes over very well to have the customer engaging at that deeper level, because they're the ones that know what needs to be done. Now, a traditional sponsor may also be, say, a senior manager who's sort of the internal executive sponsor. So there's, obviously communication that needs to happen, I think, in both traditional project management and in Agile project management, to make sure that the internal sponsors, whether it's your budget manager or your senior leaders of your organization, know where you are and how things are going, and know if there are issues. And that's true both of traditional and Agile. Obviously, some of the visual management techniques that I went over and some of the tools that are available make that information pretty transparent, which is a nice thing, I think, for people who have sort of an internal business interest in how things are going. Any other questions from anybody?
There is one more here. Looks like it's from Sergio, and he's asking if you could please show the slide recommendations for the team members.
Okay. So there you go. Recommendations for the team members. Again, hopefully it's developing the techniques and the tools to feel confident to, develop that situational leadership role for yourself. Hopefully learning, identifying things that you can develop as a team, and taking advantage of opportunities. Make sure you're communicating, creating those tactical plans. Communication is critical, and hopefully you have some way of demonstrating progress, either low tech, high tech, but that's a key thing.
Okay, it looks like we have time for just one more question. While we're waiting for someone to type in the last question, I'm going to remind everybody once again, our next webinar is next Tuesday, December 11th, and it will be Hacks for Effective Problem Solving by Abha Budraja. She is a quality group manager with National Instruments in Austin, Texas. And Laura, it doesn't look like we have any more questions, so I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up for today.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Norval, and thank you to ASQ. These webinars are really great, and I enjoy being both a participant and a presenter, so keep up the good work.
Thank you, Laura, and thanks everyone else for joining us today. We appreciate it, and we hope to see you online next Tuesday. Until then, I'd like to wish everybody a great rest of the day, and bye now.